Ka hoki ki ka hua matakana hua tapu a io. Io te toe o kāraki. Io matakana, io tapu, io wānaka. Whakataua, whakataua. Whakataua raki e tui honei, whakataua papatua nuku e takoto nei. Titia kia oho, titia kia wātea. Titia ki te poho o tāne nui a raki e. Tūturu mai kia whakamaua kia tīna, tīna. Haumi e hui e, tāi ki e.
Pre-contact history for Pigeon Bay was associated not only with that bay but also some outer bays beyond there. So you've got Menzies Bay, which was Kirikiri Wairia. You had Squally Bay, which is all Tohukapai, and then around to Decanter Bay and Little Wakaroa beyond that as well. So all of those bays were connected in a network that was associated with a hapu called Kei Te Kahukura. And that is the hapu most strongly associated with Pigeon Bay. So Te Kahukura was an ancestress, and she was a mix of Kātikuri whakapapa and Kaitu Heitara whakapapa. But she was the ancestress of the families who lived in a corridor. So you would go from Squally Bay across down through Pigeon Bay, up and over the hill toward Pukutahi, and then following the Wainui side of Wakaroa Harbour, and then out to Taumotu along the Kaitoretes. But that was the corridor of Kei Te Kahukura.
The rocks have come from Banks Peninsula. I can't tell you exactly where because they were in a nursery in Wakaroa. And my husband had been put into the Wakaroa hospital, and they said, would you come back and have lunch? We invite partners to come on a Sunday. So I was so excited about being a partner and not just Mrs. Hay. I bounced way down, went to the nursery, found that they were selling the rocks. How much did I want for them? And all these, plus a whole lot more that had been left at home. And they said $100 for the lot. So I bought them then and there and thought, well, I'll get them over to the cottage at some stage. So then when I left the cottage, the first thing that had to come with me was my rocks. I didn't really mind about the furniture or things like that. It was my rocks that I wanted. And by the time I had the rocks and the various plants that I've saved, it cost me more to bring those than it did my whole household furniture. And then when I got here, everyone was so kind, and they positioned the rocks into a sort of a rock garden. I say that that's my river with the shingle in it, and this bit under here is my forest. But this plant is Silmesia macaui, and it is another endemic to the peninsula. And it's a lovely Silmesia, which is a New Zealand's white daisy. The stems are about as tall as this. Last year it flowered, and I was very excited, but it doesn't look as if there are any flowers coming this time. So every time I look out onto here, I've got my peninsula rocks and this lovely plant, which is another of Banks's plants that he took to England with him.
This here is also, I would imagine, pretty much original as well. And when I came here, I knew this one was here, but it was really covered with a lot of things like ivy, honeysuckle, and they were really full of bits and really rotten. And we've got this wonderful man called Ray Hasty, who's a 75-year-old master craftsman. And he came in and he's fixed these up for us, and I think he's done a magnificent job. They're beautiful now. You'll see a lot of A's and E's in it, and that's for Agnes and Ebenezer hay. And also there's a lot of apparently numbers for kids and what have you. Apparently in the day, this one here that we're looking at is the woman's one. And the women will sit there and have tea and tiny cakes, and the men will sit in that one and drink whiskey and smoke cigars. So yeah, this was pretty much as it was originally. We kept a lot of the old pieces. We were taking everything off it. They did grow things like honeysuckle over it because at the time these trees weren't here, of course, so they had no shade. Now we've got the shade, there's no need for it anymore, so that's why I took all the windings off. Pretty much this is as it was. Even the seating that's not original, of course, but that's how the seat, you can see the original parts of the seat, and they were hand done. And they were done with like an axe. I think they're just beautiful.
Before that, there weren't a lot of people who white-baited, and I was one of the most frequent, I suppose. But the women got together and they would come down with their children and they would white-bait over on that edge there. As I say, a real social gathering. One of them, on the first day, got quite a few whitebait, so she was so proud she took them home and left them on the table to show her husband, and the cat ate them, so it wasn't a very good ending, but no, there were some of them, well, my wife was amongst them. She would come down, and about 4 o'clock after school I'd come down and take her place, so they were running, and well, they were all round. If you came late and there weren't many places left, the people would say, "Oh, come on, you can fit in here, all right." So that was really good. It was a great social thing. These wooden structures here were put in by fisheries or someone, and they were meant to fence off the grass so that the cattle didn't eat it, and then that left it grass for the whitebait to spawn on. But I think they should have been up a bit further. I've seen most of the bund of that big willow up there.
Kei te kahukura, as the hapu of that area, maintained the esoteric schools of learning, and they were over at Otohuka Pai and a place called Otohuka o Te Ao, which are all in the same locality. It's all farmland now, but that's where our schools of learning were. And their responsibility was to maintain and progress that knowledge amongst the people. And one of the last tauira, the last learners in that space, was this man on the wall here, Hone Tare Tika. So in his book he recalls being taught by 2 tohuka. One was named Koroko, and the other one was named Tuowo. And those 2 tohuka were his relatives, but they were also the priests of Otohuka Ora o Te Ao. So he was the last to be instructed in that place. A lot of the learnings that are mentioned, some of the learnings that are mentioned within Paua's book, which is called Tikao Talks, leave signposts for how the knowledge can be regained. So he was chosen because he was the last of a family that was essentially the morehu, the only survivor after the raids of Te Rauparaha. So when Te Rauparaha and Ngāti Toa and their allies came south, they conducted full-scale warfare on our people. But one of the impacts specifically was over at Otohuka Ora o Te Ao and Otohuka Pai, and probably Pigeon Bay too, where massacres of men, women and children were conducted, and some quite atrocious actions were taken to prevent people from living there anymore. So water wells were poisoned, cultivations were burned, houses were burned. It was real warfare tactics. But Pauatamati was his father. He was one of 5 siblings, and those 5 siblings were very active in Wakaroa. So Te Whare Rākau was one of them. He was a canoe builder, and where he used to carve his canoes was over at Kako Mutu Holmes Bay. Another brother was Te Whata Kaupapa. Then they had a sister, Hine I Te Ata Ariari. Paua Puraki. Puraki had the other name of John Love, and he was the one who signed the treaty on behalf of Kei Te Kahukura.
So all the sheep would be herded into those pens up there, and there'd be quite a team of shearers brought in to do the shearing. And it was my mum's job to provide lunch and dinner for them. They lived in a little hut just down the road, which is now gone. But I remember helping her to take morning and afternoon tea up to the shearing shed. She'd make scones and pikelets and biscuits and big thermoses of tea, and it was great. I just remember this big wooden floor. There's the smell of lanolin. It's a gorgeous, deep, rich smell. It goes right into the wood. Because of course the sheep dragged across to be shorn, and then the fleece is taken over to a great big sorting table. Dags and things were removed, and then they'd pack the wool into these enormous sacks and graded according to the quality of the wool. And then somebody would be stitching up the sacks with an enormous needle and string, and then it was all stamped on the side with Glen Relic, so ready to be trucked off to Christchurch.
Because I think up the top of Starvation Gully there was quite a forestry block. The teacher, Nancy Duxbury, she told me where Starvation Gully goes, there was actually a railway track down there that they used to sort of send the timber, for it to be shipped out. And so I guess that these were forestry workers or, working on milling the timber or something. Nancy said when the gold rush came, a lot of the men, they were going to make a fortune, you see, so off they went to the gold fields and left their families behind. And no money sort of came back, so they actually had to go down and find mussels and that from the beach.
In the early 20th century, my grandfather bought a block of land at Little Pigeon Bay. And because it was very isolated then, they used to go round by sea and take a whole team of people, men around there. And I think they built a house there in about 1917. They lived there for a period, and when Dad was ready to go to school, because there was no sort of access down into the bay, he went back and lived with his grandparents in Little Wakaroa and went to the Chorlton school. Dad came back from serving in the Second World War, and they settled over at Tipperary and began their married life. When we were young, we wanted to know what went on. He didn't divulge a heck of a lot. As we grew older and more mature and things, that he did start to let a bit out, and he subsequently wrote a bit of an account of his war service, and the odd bit got published in the Wakaroa Mail. He trained in the Air Force. I understand he wanted to be a fighter pilot, but he was too tall. He ended up going down the bomber pilot's road, and he served in a number of squadrons overseas. He ended up doing what they call 2 tours, which is, I think each tour is about 25 bombing raids. The history of people surviving some of those things is pretty lucky. I think they thought by the time he'd done that, he'd done enough. When Dad left to serve, he left from Chorlton. I don't think there's any, I'm sure there's not any recognition on the War Memorial down in the bay. There's a bit of written recognition inside the church at Little Wakaroa.
Now, prior to the Port Levy's purchase, there were two other sales that occurred to the French. One was over here at Kaihope and over here at Holmes Bay. That was what also put the wind up the English government. Our people of the day had more reason to side with the French than we did to side with the English. The major discussion that happened prior to the signing of the treaty was, why should we side with the British when we've got better relationships and better opportunities with the French? So Puraki took his name John Love as a result of his time as a whaler, but also as a result of his time as a student of a university in France. He travelled back to France, and that is where he learned the skills necessary to become a surveyor and a native assessor. The family say he was fluent in French, German, English and Māori. And so that influence in his time actually in France served to also influence the relationships, because back home he was of rangatira standing and was the chief of Kaiteka Hukura. So he had seen firsthand, and in those days the words of rangatira was law. My own belief is that it's that experience that gave the French an advantage in this space. It's why we have an Wakaroa township with French names, mokopuna of the original French settlers who still live in these spaces. And even some of our own families have connections to both sides. So when it came time to sign the treaty in 1840, there was a huge debate, and the debate was, why? Why should we sign this treaty with the English, remembering that only a few years before it was the English who brought Te Rauparaha in Ngāti Toa. Ultimately, they agreed, and John Love and another chief who lived in this harbour, Iwiko, were the two representatives that were sent out to the ship to sign the treaty on behalf of our people. And people ask, why was there only two chiefs who signed? And the short answer is suspicion. There was suspicion about being invited onto English ships. Every time our chiefs went out there, they got killed. So the debate was held on shore, and they sent the two emissaries out to the ship. But it's intricately connected with Wakaroa, for the fact that Puraki preferred that as his home. Yeah, we regard it as a very close family association with the place, not only for the urupa and our bones that are there, but for the connection with the Māori.
So anyway, when I first came here, I was told about the daffodils here, and I'd sort of forgot about this here. I didn't come down here for ages. And one night I was walking down here, we had a little fox terrier, and we were just coming out shooting. I came in, and this whole area, I'm talking the whole lot, was full of daffodils. And these are old daffodils too, that's perfume. And on a really nice night, you could smell them from the homestead. I thought, I just couldn't believe my luck. Honestly, you could back your car up and fill your boat up. There was just thousands of daffodils. All different types too. And it's because of all these trees, over the years, leaf drop, the soil in here is incredibly fertile. This is Alfred Buxton for sure. This is his influence on this. Because you can still see the leaves of the daffodils. So you just leave them, don't touch them. And then I just cut all the grass down, and then I don't do anything else. Keep coming up every year. But this year was good. We had so much rain. On the right hand side, all up into this corner here, is all bluebells and the snowdrops. But if you have a look up at where the seat is up there, I want to resurrect that because Jim Hay told me that one of his relatives actually proposed to his wife up there where the daffodils were out. Yeah, that was the spot. And yeah, he proposed up there, and she said, yeah, good on her too. I mean, they were romantic a bit in those days, considered all really strict Presbyterian Scottish types.
My grandfather might have had a contract to construct or metal a whole lot of the road back in those days. In fact, it was always, because there was about 7 or 8 gates and things to open. Obviously, if you're on your own in the car, you had to get out. It was a bit of a tedious job. So the children, whoever was the passenger, got the job of opening the gates. So I know it was always our habit to try and make out you were asleep in the back so you didn't have to open the gate. Once when a vehicle went over the edge on the way out there, and the guy managed to get out. He turned up at Tipperary to tell us what had happened. And another occasion when we were at primary school, when we got to the top of the hill of coming out of Pigeon Bay and we started to go down towards the Tipperary house, my mother used to often let my brother and I hold the steering. We'd steer the car down the road down to the house, and she would stay with the feet on the control. And on one occasion, Lowell must have lost concentration because Rod decided not to take a corner, and we went over and tipped upside down on it. Had to go for a bit of a panel beat.
Now this is a very interesting plant because it's one of the plants that Banks took back to England, and when he was out here with Captain Cook, and he called Banks Peninsula Banks Island because they didn't realise that we had all the plains. But anyhow, it grows on Banks Peninsula now, and it's still growing there beautifully, and it grows up in the rocks. And years ago I got very upset because it was protected from sheep and cattle because it was up in the rocks, and then they decided goats would be a good idea to come on to Banks Peninsula to get rid of the weeds and the gorse. But then goats don't like weeds and gorse if there's anything else, and they were scrambling around the rocks, nibbling every little bit of this down. So I eventually found that wonderful man, Hugh Wilson, and I said, what are we going to do about these goats? And he said, oh, I'll talk to people at the Canterbury University and at Lincoln University, and we will get rid of the goats because it's not a good idea to have them on the peninsula. So he was instrumental in getting the goats, and I had helped. There were 7 plants that Banks took, and a lot of them are still growing on the peninsula, and then they're in the herbarium back in England now, but they're very precious, of course.
So it was 1849, treaty had been in place for 9 years, was somewhere rotting in the bottom of the government archives in Wellington. And yeah, there was a concerted attempt by the New Zealand Company and other agents, British and French agents, to buy and gain title in the Western form of land title from the people who had the authority to do so. Our people's understanding of hoko was it was a reciprocal thing, and hoko was translated in English as sale. And so with hoko, we understood it as a cultural norm whereby you paid a price to use it for a certain time, and when it wasn't required anymore, it reverted back to the rangatira. Whereas in the English sense of the word, hoko was translated to sale. The European understanding of that was, you sell it, it's gone forever. Now our people by this stage were starting to wise up to a few of the government's tricks of the day, but the nasty trick they played on us here was because they knew of our history with Te Rauparaha and that he'd come down and conducted massacre and slaughter upon us. They then started saying to our people, well, if you don't sell us your land, we'll go to Ngāti Toa, who by Māori custom, in their minds, should be the owners of the land now. And our people were vehemently against any sales because they didn't want to lose their land. But one of our chiefs who lived here, Apera Pukenui, had a vision to protect the interests of our mana, of our tupune, and said to our people, if we do not sell, we will lose all mana to this land. Our people reluctantly agreed to the sale. The terms of sale from our perspective were we would have ample land reserves. There would be at least a tenth of the land area sold, and we wanted reserves here in Koukourārata, one in Wakaroa, and one in O'Kane's Bay. In addition to that, the government was to provide for schools, hospitals, and also a hostel in Christchurch City, which was then a fledgling settlement. Close to 500,000 acres, I estimate, that was being asked for. The head of this harbour all the way around to Flea Bay, back along the mountain ridges, and then up and over this hill, down the Kaituna Valley to the lake, which was our ealing space. So all of that land was sold for £300. and the promises to give us a tenth of the land back in reserves were ignored. We were given 1,400 acres here, which is the reserve we're in today, but O'Kane's Bay and Pigeon Bay missed out, and our families who were still living on that land were progressively evicted. Titles were on-sold to settler communities. So a lot of our traditional connections with wāhi tapu are now conducted through good relationships with the farmers.
Because I know when the Davidsons were there, our cousin Faye Blomquist, who's one of the younger cousins, she was down from Auckland and visiting her dad, who was left, Uncle Len was left on his own. So we're talking to the Davidsons, so I was telling the Davidsons about it. Oh, bring him over, he must come over and have a look. So we said to Uncle Len, would you like to come over? And oh no. And he always said no, always, didn't matter. And then a bit later on, we're sure you wouldn't like to, yes, that would be a nice idea. You know, didn't matter what you're going to do, it was always no. He went over and Frank Davidson, his wife, met Uncle Len at the front door, right up those front steps to the front door. When he walked up there, the tears were running down his cheeks. It was the first time he'd ever walked into that house by the front door. He always had to go around to the side door and get his money out the window. All those years he lived and worked in the bay. Yeah.
The sports days, I remember those very well. Well, they don't have much like that now. And then they introduced a cross country that went across the fences and over the creek and over the road and over a fence and up the hill where the original Hayes house was and up and come back down. Yeah, and the boat club, of course, for a start, most of the members were locals. They had big regattas and racing. They were with over 70 boats sometimes. We had first footing on Boxing Day. We just everyone would start at one place, drink with them, and then pick them up, and we'd go somewhere else, and then we'd do all the sort of
Christmas cake at each place.
Yes, and a good chatter and laugh. Oh, it was a bit risky going to some places because the roads were pretty terrible then, and
up to Shadbolts.
Shadbolts, yes, and then we go out to Crawlers. We put on that lovely concert with Alison Waghorn called Boo to a Goose. I remember that, and she had all the kids singing. The Renishes all had their parts. Well, Arbor Day was a special day. We always planted a tree, and Jim Hay from Glenrelic and Don from Inverrelic, they would buy a plant, or plants, swamp cypress, I think they were called, along the main road, and they are still there. And Don Hay bought the Norfolk pines that are in front of the hall, those two. It was a good day for school. We had to make up a poem that the kids did, and the poem, I can still remember the end of it because the kid says, and though growing so tall, yet are they looked down upon by those who, as children many years ago, planted, tended and watched them grow. It stuck in my mind because it was really deep. Yeah.
Our teacher was Mr. Ron Ward. He taught all the streams from, I guess, 8 to 12 in the one classroom here. He was quite keen on gold panning down on the west coast, and one time he had brought some gold nuggets back, and he got us all out there with our gold pans and showed us how they, pan for gold. And of course we found gold nuggets and we were all terribly excited, not realising of course that he had been out there before us carefully planting them in the creek.
He was a very influential general, Te Raupara. While he did a lot of bad, nasty things down this part of the country, his strategy was flawless to allow him to keep coming back in, because it was three journeys he came south. The ending of those fights was facilitated through two things. One was the advent of Christianity, and so people like his son and his nephew, Tamihana Te Raupara and Mātini Te Whiwhi, actually came here to preach the gospel. But the other mechanism was what we call the pauroko, and the pauroko are peace marriages. Taiaroa's daughter was given in marriage to one of the Te Raupara family, our own family. So a couple of generations later, Paohone's daughter, my great-grandmother, married someone of Ngāti Mutunga and Ngāti Toa descent. The strategy the old people left behind was, if we marry each other and the children are of mixed blood, we cannot fight ourselves. So a lot of our families, when you hear a reference to the pauroko, or in the North Island it's referred to as the tatou pounamu, that is a reference to the families of two lineages.
Originally, of course, all of this was forested, and like most of the timber from Annandale and Pigeon Bay, most of that timber went round to build the walls at Milton, and also a lot of it went to Australia. There was a lot of houses in Milton too. And so, of course, so they stripped all of the forest, so there's nothing left. And in 1868, I think it was, they had 3 weeks of non-stop rain, and the whole hillside behind there was 3 slips. So apparently the first slip came down. We're talking a major house here with wool sheds, hay barns, dog kennels, chicken coops, everything, everything on a farm. And the first slip came down and actually went right into the back of the wool shed. And then the third one, by this time it's quite late in the evening, and they were sitting down, they were about to sit down for tea. They had all the fires in the homestead going, and there's one of the sons who went outside to do something and came in and said that the hillside was moving, and I reckon it was 14 metres high. I mean, we're talking big. And it just came down, and by the time, it just took the whole thing out. By the time it hit the sea, it was on fire. Everything was gone. And then it was a huge storm, and they had to boat. There were 28 slips around to Holmes Bay Road. They had to row boats across here with the kids and everything. The police family, they let them in there to stay, and they just never left.
Well, Milena would have been a very regular churchgoer here. She was herself Presbyterian at that time. She later became confirmed as an Anglican when we moved to Christchurch, and when it was time for me to be confirmed. My father was not a churchgoer. I have a feeling that may have had a lot to do with his war years experiences. So I don't think my dad ever came to church here or in Christchurch. My dad spent 4 years in a prisoner of war camp in Austria, and he didn't talk very much about it. The only time I ever heard him talk about it was there was a POW reunion in Christchurch one year, and a friend of his and his wife came down from Napier. And so inevitably the two men got talking about POW days. Dad's friend had been in Poland in the salt mines, and I was all ears at the time. It was the only time I remember my dad really talking about it. He remembered the Red Cross parcels very clearly, and how one parcel had to be shared out among 12 men in a camp room, and how it all had to be divided up exactly equally so that nobody got any more than anybody else. Yeah, they were hard years, so I think that must have perhaps really challenged any faith that he might have had as a boy.
But you know, we've got a long history with Pigeon Bay. A chap called Captain White came out from Scotland and Rhode Island, and he came here to Pigeon Bay and worked at various jobs around the place, and he married a Maori princess. We're talking about very early on.
In the early days of the whalers, and the shipbuilders too. You know, they built numerous ships for transporting produce to Melbourne. Some of the hay books I've been reading, they name the ships that they built. There were several built down Hobart Bay. We had the wherewithal with the raw materials, and yeah, it's amazing how they could do it.
We can talk about the Maori Wars. When Koukourārata was threatening here, that Maori princess Koukourārata was her name. She came across from Port Levy to Pigeon Bay to warn of that. But anyway, they had a large family. One of the Maori children, Sarah, the daughter, she married William Innes, who came out from Scotland. There is quite a strong Ngāi Tahu link there. So William and Sarah lived up there. They had a big family again, and that was both our grandfathers. David's grandfather stayed here. My grandfather went to farm out at Sheffield. Dave's mother, Reno, was a Hay, the daughter of Robert Steele Hay, who was a cousin of the Ebenezer's. Consequently, down through the generations, the farming happened. The Innes farm up there was sold, but there is a photo of Thomas White and the family.
Aku e mihi atu kia kautapu te iwi Māori. No reira, tēnei te mihi kia kautau, kia orara, ka tangi te manu ti ori ori, ka tangi te ngā kau tangata. No reira, tēnei te mihi kia kautau, kia orara, kia kautau, kia orara.